concentrate tonight on three verses, verses 6, 7, and 8. So let's read those together, if you will, as we get started here. Starting in verse 6. And before the throne was a sea of glass like unto crystal. In the midst of the throne and round about the throne were four beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, and the second beast like a calf. And the third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. And the four beasts had each of them 6 wings about him, and they were full of eyes within. And they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. Let's pray. Father, as we start to get into this section of this book, you have revealed to us a great deal of what's going to happen in the future. And some of it is tragic, and some of it is hard to understand, and some of it is majestic. But through it all, help us not to get caught up in the mystery of it and the craziness of it, but help us to see you high and lifted up. Because it truly is a book revealing what you want us to know about yourself and about what you are trying to do. And I trust that as we get into the judgments, that we would understand from the groundwork who you really are and why you have to judge them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. English class. Can anyone tell me what a metaphor is? Okay. What is a simile? Okay. So you're comparing one thing to another, but you most frequently use the terms like or as. You are going to notice that in the passage that we are getting into, there are times when John is going to say, it was. And there are a lot of times where he is going to say, it was like this, or it was as such a lesson that helps us as human beings to relate to something that he is seeing, but he struggles more often than not to try and describe it. And as I've been studying these different passages, every time we get to a section like this, I try to go and cross-reference with Ezekiel and others, Daniel, to see what they saw. And what's interesting is when you go to Ezekiel, you can sit down and read the passage that we're getting ready to go to in a little bit here, and you could study it for several hours, and you'd have a massive headache, and you'd probably be just as confused as when you started. Because Ezekiel gets this glimpse into heaven, and he sees these majestic beings, kind of like what John is getting ready to describe here. And yet he says, and they had these wheels, they had these wheels upon wheels, they had these outer wheels that were turning, and then these inner wheels that were turning, and they had, John MacArthur describes it as God's war machine. The inner workings of clock and how it all functions together. But he is talking about things that most ordinary people wouldn't understand because they've never seen it. And so as we go through here, we're going to be very careful. I'm going to give you, trust me, a sampling of some of what scholars have said about some of these things. And then we're going to be really careful, as we are with the whole rest of the book. Because I don't want you to walk away and say, well, Pastor said it was such and such. No. John says this, and we can say, well, it's like this, or maybe it's symbolic of this, but let's be careful and let's not go beyond what John revealed to us. All right? That's our groundwork for tonight. We are before the throne. In chapter 4, John gets this incredibly rare look where he gets called up and he is allowed to see heaven and he is allowed to see the throne room of God. And tonight we're going to go a little deeper into that throne room, and we're going to see some interesting things that are happening there. He starts here at the beginning of verse 6, and he is talking about sea of glass like unto crystal. Now, notice again, he didn't say it was crystal. He is trying to describe the sea of glass, and he notices the properties, and the properties were a whole lot like crystal. And you say, a sea. Why a sea? Well, it's not a real sea, obviously enough. But a sea has certain qualities about it. Usually when you go to the beach and you look out across the Pacific Ocean, we did that when we were in California, I just happened to notice that when I was glancing out there, I couldn't see Hawaii. And I know from experience in flying to Australia that you can get on a plane in LAX and you can fly for hours and hours and hours, and then somewhere in the middle of the journey you're already tired and you look and it's like, oh, the plane's over top of Hawaii. And I tried to look down, but it was dark, didn't see anything. And hours and hours and hours and hours later, you end up in New Zealand, and then we puddle jump to Australia. 14-hour flight. I don't know about you, but I don't know how fast the plane was going. They tell you all that stuff when you're on there, but after a few hours, I could have cared less how fast we were going. It wasn't fast enough. I can tell you this. Let me understate it. The Pacific Ocean's big. And what John is doing here is he looks into the throne room, and he's noticed the throne, and he's noticed these elders, and he's noticed the thunder and the lightning and everything coming out of it. And then he pauses for a minute and he says, I saw this sea, and it was this broad expanse. Maybe it represents the empire of God. Maybe it represents creation, because creation is far bigger and broader than we can imagine. All you have to do is go to the Creation Museum and watch that long thing, where they take you out there light years. Oh my goodness. And they use language, it's kind of like talking about the national debt. A light year and $1 trillion, kind of the same thing. I can't comprehend how far we are in debt, and I can't comprehend how far Orion's belt is away from me. Okay? You can tell me light years, that means about as much as $1 trillion. Broad expanse. But there's a couple of things I want you to notice about this broad expanse, because you're going to see this contrast as we keep going through the book. Not only is it this huge, immeasurable expanse, but he says, it was a sea of glass. Now, when we think of glass, we think of something breakable. I had the pleasure of visiting the Grand Canyon with my folks one time. That was a long time before they put that little glass bridge up out there. And I'd like to go back and I'd like to take my boys, but I've always wondered, do I have the guts to walk out on a glass bridge? I mean, I'm sure the engineers sat down and thought about the whole thing, and there's a weight limit, and all that kind of stuff, but seriously, how much of an earthquake does there need to be before? It's glass. We think of glass as something that's fragile. But in a little bit, I'm going to show you that they're standing on it. It's also something else. It's transparent. In other words, there's nothing to hide. When John looks at the throne room of God and he sees a sea of glass, there's nothing to hide there. There's no shadow. There's nothing that can't be revealed. There's just light. It's smooth. Went water skiing one time on Lake Erie. Went with the youth group. Everybody's getting their turn and they're out there going, and then this guy walks up and he says, hey gang, we're going to have to pack up and go. We got a storm coming in. Lake Erie's pretty famous for having quick storms come up, and it's going to get kind of choppy. And I was standing there and I had all my stuff on. I said, I don't get to try. And the guy said, listen, it's going to be rough, but if you want to go, I'll take you one big loop out across there. I said, I'd like to try it just so I can say I water skied on Lake Erie. I still can't really say I water skied on Lake Erie. I've broken horses in my life that made my body hurt for days afterwards, but nothing I think will ever compare. I don't know. I was in a car wreck one time, it hurt pretty bad. Nothing will compare to hitting whitecaps that are about a yard apart. I never touched the main part of Lake Erie. It was like bam, 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 bam. And yeah, we went a big long ride. About halfway through it, I thought, this is awful. You could tell a storm was coming. There was no peace in my body. And you can guarantee I wasn't letting go of that rope and falling, because there's no way in the world I was going into that mess. That boat was jumping, I was jumping, everything was... And that's going to be the scene on earth in 2 more chapters. You realize that? We are 2 chapters away from the first seal being opened. But before we start opening the seals and we see the earthquakes and we see the hail and we see the rough, John says, I looked and I noticed that under the throne was a sea of glass. Transparent, clear, open, revealing, but calm. Calm. And the whole rest of the book, while there's chaos on earth, there is always calm in heaven. Why? Because the one that sits on the throne is on the throne. Undisturbed. Crystal, it's solid, it's clear, it's shimmering, it's beautiful. It seems to be the floor by the wording that's used here. I want to read to you Warren Wiersbe's commentary on this, because he draws quite a few parallels between the heavenly sanctuary that is described in the book of Revelation and the earthly temple that was located at Jerusalem. The earthly temple had the Holy of Holies. The heavenly sanctuary has the throne room of God that John has the opportunity to be standing in. The 7-branched candlestick, the 7 lamps of fire before the throne. The bronze laver, the sea of glass, discussed here. The cherubim over the mercy seat, the 4 living creatures around the throne that we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. The priests in the temple, the 24 elders in God's throne room. The brazen altar, there's also an altar in Revelation chapter 6. The incense altar, there's an incense altar in Revelation chapter 8. The Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Covenant is also in God's sanctuary in Revelation chapter 11. Now, I said we're going to be careful that we're not going to go too far with this. But can I just suggest to you that maybe this is similar to the bronze laver at the temple, and the reason it's similar between the sanctuary that we see of God in heaven and what it is the temple in Jerusalem is because the temple in Jerusalem was supposed to be symbolic of where God dwells. And the more I get into it and the more I study it, there are things that I never thought about before. You know, you just think of them as coincidences. But there's cherubim over the mercy seat, and there were cherubim guarding the Holy of Holies. We'll get to that in a minute. And you have cherubim in God's presence, and they're referred to over and over again as the book goes on. And I thought, well, I mean, it's totally possible. After all, if God is going to design for him a dwelling place on earth, why can't it be similar to what he has in heaven, like he says that I am created in the image of him? Now, I might be created in the image of God, but I certainly don't look like him. And most of the time, I certainly don't act like him. And so I don't think it's fair to say that the temple in Jerusalem looked exactly like God's sanctuary does in the heavenlies. No, that's not the point. Just saying that he probably modeled it after the sanctuary in the heavenlies. And that's what he is looking at. And if that's true, and it's similar to the bronze laver at the temple, what was the bronze laver at the temple used for? Well, it was used for the priests washing their hands and doing their purification before their sacrifice. It was very important in the cleansing ritual. And a priest that was involved in sacrifice that didn't cleanse himself could die. A very serious judgment for entering in God's presence without being holy. In Ephesians 5:26 it says, by the washing of water by the word. And so it makes me wonder, maybe this sea of glass that we see there is the Word of God. Now, I said we're going to be careful not to go too far, and I'm just saying maybe. And the reason I think that maybe that's possible is because in a little bit we're going to see that the saints are standing on it. I'll give you a quote from Martin Luther. He's at the diet of worms. That's not anything like the Atkins diet. It's the the assembly of a town called Worms in 1521, and he was commanded to repudiate his writings. The official transcript quotes him as saying, "Unless I am convicted by Scripture and plain reason, I do not accept the authority of popes and councils because they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. I can and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe, so help me God." Later, that's what the official transcript says. Luther says that he ended with, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." Stand on what? That my conscience is captive to what? Word of God. Now, it's interesting, if you study that word in the New Testament, the armor of a Christian, when we are told to stand, starts off with a belt of truth, and our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And so if you're going to make a stand somewhere, how can you make a stand without standing on truth? And I wonder if John is implying to us that on top of this throne is the truth of the Word of God that supports everything else that's happening there. Unchangeable in heaven. Let's go to Revelation chapter 11, verse 19 real quickly. The temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voice and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. Now let's go to chapter 15. Chapter 15, verse 8. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Now let's jump all the way to the end, towards the end, chapter 21, verse 22. Talking about the new heaven and the new earth. And he said, "And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it." So we have this interesting transition that takes place, because in the earlier parts of the book of Revelation, there are several references to the temple of God. And then, when we have a new heaven and a new earth, all of a sudden there's no temple anymore, because God the Father and God the Son are here. It is possible that the temple in Jerusalem was designed based on the dwelling place of God. But the verse doesn't say, "He saw a sea of glass," which is the Word of God. So let's be careful and not go above what John says. Back to chapter 4. Second half of verse 6, he introduced these 4 beasts. And I wrestle a little bit with how to deal with this. You're going to get the shotgun. I wish you could see my notes. Well, probably better off you don't. Unfortunate word, beasts. It connotates to us some of the dreams like Daniel would have had about nations rising up, and you saw this leopard and you saw this, and that's not what they're talking about here. You look at the Greek word, and the Greek word literally translates living creature. That's it. That's all it says. And so in KJV they translated it as beast. I wish they would have just added another word and used up the page space and put living creature. Because sometimes it gives us the wrong connotation. In the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. Now, we're going to get into some really interesting stuff here. How can these 4 beasts be in the midst of the throne and round about the throne? And trust me, I've read some men this week, and before I started my notes, I just tried to go down through and read a whole bunch of commentaries and kind of wrap your mind around what's happening here and all the agreements and the disagreements. There are some folks out here that think this has to be divine qualities of God because God's the only one that sits on the throne. Listen, John didn't say these beasts were on the throne, did he? We already talked about what's on the throne. He says they're in the midst of the throne. And they're round about the throne. And so there's a lot of argument. How can you be in the midst of something and how can you be round about it? And so basically what happens is this word means coming from. It doesn't mean occupying it. Roundabout means seen from every side. So you have this very interesting situation, and there's two main thoughts. Possibly under it and sticking out, maybe facing north, south, east, and west, supporting the throne. We see that in Solomon. He had golden lions on one side, and he had golden lions on the other. And he had ivory sitting under it. And so not only was he elevated, but then his throne was up higher. And we often see a picture of God's throne being above everything else. Is his throne on these four beasts? I don't know. All I know is John is struggling to tell us what he sees, and he says, well, they were in the midst of the throne, and even the word midst could be interpreted near, in proximity to. John MacArthur and several others seem to think they are talking about the fact that they are in constant motion around the throne. And in a minute we're going to go to Ezekiel, and we'll look at the description that he gives us there. The theories of the scholars, if it's the first one and they're under it and they're kind of sticking out so that you can see them from the four sides, but their backs are under it supporting the throne, most of those folks think that because of that it would be the four main attributes of God: majesty, strength, intelligence, and divine vigilance. The only problem I have with that a little bit is in a few minutes we're going to see them worshiping God. And so you've kind of got to be a little bit careful here about all the symbolism. Number two, there are a lot of folks who think that these are ministers of the church because they are between the throne and the 24 elders. We know the 24 elders are representative of the redeemed church, and so there are a whole lot of scholars out there who believe that these four beasts are the go-betweens between God and the church. Now, that concerns me a great deal because that almost takes us into the realm of Catholicism, where you can't approach God unless you have a priest. And my Bible tells me over and over and over and over and over again that I have direct access to the throne of God. So it worries me a little bit about that thought. A lot of folks believe they are cherubim. And cherubim are interesting creatures because the Bible doesn't have a ton to say about them, but sometimes what it does say really makes you wonder what the world's going to look like when you get there. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 1. Because Ezekiel, by far, has the most to say about a cherubim. When I started in chapter 1 of Revelation, I almost stopped and told y'all we do it 5 years from now after we did Ezekiel. Just couldn't break Teresa's heart. Ezekiel chapter 1, starting with verse 4. Now bear with me, there's a lot of reading here, but it's important. Okay? And I looked, and beheld a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it. And out of the midst thereof is the color of amber. Remember that from our study last week. Out of the midst of the fire, also out of the midst thereof came the likeness of 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They had the simile, likeness of a man. And every one had 4 faces, and every one had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot, clothed. And they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. And they had the hands of a man under their wings on their 4 sides. 4 sides. And they had 4, and they 4 had their faces and their wings. Their wings were joined one to another, that they turned not when they went, and they went every one straight forward. As for the likeness of their faces, they 4 had the face of a man, and the face of a lion on the right side, and they 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. They 4 also had the face of an eagle. Now, notice the same 4 critters were mentioned in Revelation. But what you're going to notice as we read Ezekiel here, there are some differences. John saw critters that had 6 wings. Ezekiel saw critters that had 4 wings. John says they had 1 face. One of them looked like a lion. One of them looked like an ox. One of them looked like a man, and one of them looked like an eagle. And Ezekiel says, every one of the four had four faces, and every one of them had the same four faces, and all four of their faces were in the same order. You say, how in the world can that be? Listen, there are similar beings being described, and I think the only difference here is that Ezekiel is seeing them from one way and John's seeing them from another. That's the only thing that I see here. You ask two people what happened in an accident, you're going to get two completely different perspectives, especially depending upon which way they are looking at it. He goes on. Verse 13, as for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire and like the appearance of lamps. It went up and down among the living creatures, and the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. And the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. Now as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth by the living creature with his four faces. The appearance of the wheels and their work was like unto the color of beryl. And they four had one likeness, and their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they went upon their four sides, and they turned not when they went. As for their rings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes round about them four. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them, and when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Whithersoever the Spirit was to go, they went. Thither was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. And the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creature was the color of terrible crystal, stretched forth over their heads above. And under the firmament were their wings straight, the one toward the other. Every one had two which covered on his side, and every one had two which covered on that side their bodies. And when they went, I heard the noise of their wings, like the noise of great waters, as the voice of the Almighty, the voice of speech, as the noise of a host. When they stood, they let down their wings. And there was a voice from the firmament that was over their heads when they stood, and had let down their wings. Now, we don't have the time to keep going. We could go on. He talks again about the amber, and he talks again about the appearance of the rainbow that was over them. All of these things that we see in Revelation, Ezekiel saw when he was looking at it. Different perspective, different description. And all of them are struggling to kind of really tell us what's going on. But I want you to turn to Ezekiel chapter 10 before we go back to Revelation, because in Ezekiel chapter 10, he's going to go back and he's going to tell us what he saw in chapter 1. Chapter 10, verse 15, he identifies these critters that had faces and the wings and the wheels and how they ran all straight without turning around. Verse 15 it says, well, let's go back to 14. And everyone had four faces. The first face was the face of a cherub, and the second face was the face of a man, and the third the face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an angel or of an eagle. And the cherubims were lifted up. This is the living creature that I saw by the river Kabar. So he identifies them as cherubims, and when the cherubims went, the wheels went by them, and when the cherubims lifted up their wings, the wheels went also. So we know that they are cherubims. You say, what else do we know about cherubims? Not a lot. Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, Adam and Eve have sinned and they get kicked out of the garden. To keep them from going back into the garden and eating of the tree of life and living forever in their sin, God sets two cherubim on the outside of the garden to guard the gate. And they stood there with a flaming sword. Now, I don't know about you, but when you see pictures of cherubim painted by Michelangelo or Van Gogh or anything like that, they're, fat little babies that look cute and cuddly. I'm pretty sure that if I saw a critter with 4 wings or 6 wings and they walked straight and they flew and they had eagle face and man face, I wouldn't think that they were cute and cuddly. And I'm pretty sure Adam and Eve didn't walk up to the cherubim and try and beg them to get back into the garden. I'm pretty sure they understood that they weren't supposed to go there. See, it seems to me that every time cherubim are mentioned in the Bible, they are guardians of God's holiness. I'll give you some instances. 2 Samuel 6:2 and in 2 Samuel 22:11. talks about the two cherubim, if you remember, that have their heads down with their wings up over, and the mercy seat is in the middle of the Ark of the Covenant. And over again, the Bible talks about that being the dwelling place of God on earth is on the above the mercy seat and between the cherubim. In Isaiah 37:16, it says, God dwells between the cherubim. In 1 Kings 6:23 through 28, cherubim that are carved out of wood, and they're like 10 cubits high, and their wingspan is like 10 cubits. And two of them stand there between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And they stand there with their wings outstretched, and one wing touches one wall, and the other one standing on that side with his far wing touching that one, and in the middle their two wings are touching. So you have this picture of these two giant cherubim standing there with their wings outtouched, from fingertip to fingertip to fingertip, covers the entire front of the temple. Behind them is the curtain that separates the holy place. They're covered completely in gold. A picture of sheltering the holiness of God and not allowing anybody into that presence. You say, what do these critters stand for? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Go back to Revelation chapter 4. Depending upon your translation of what these critters actually are. If you relate it to the created world, then the lion represents the wild animals, and the calf represents the domestic animals, and the eagle represents the flying creatures, and man represents the pinnacle of creation. I have a couple problems with that. Why aren't the fish represented, and why aren't the plant life represented? Why aren't the stars and everything else represented? Symbolically, the lion always stands for strength. The calf stands for service because it's a yoked animal. The man stands for reason or intellect, and the eagle for speed. And there are folks that say, no, wait a minute, no, these four critters represent the nation of Israel, because when the Ark of the Covenant moved and they set up the tabernacle, they always camped in a very specific formation. God told them to do that. And when they did it, the four big tribes would come in and they would set their banner up, and then everybody would camp around under the banner. And what's interesting is the lion, which would have been on the east side of the camp, represents the tribe of Judah, and Issachar and Zebulun camped with them. The oxen, the calf, was on the west side. That's the banner for Ephraim, and Manasseh and Benjamin camped with them. Man is Reuben. They were on the south side, and they were Simeon and Gad. And the eagle was the banner for Dan. They were on the north side, and they camped with Asher and Naphtali. And so you have a lot of folks saying, well, this is representation of Israel. But then you have folks saying, well, wait a minute, if these critters are holding up the throne, or even if they are cherubim that are milling around constantly before the throne, then they probably stand for the divine administration of government. Because isn't that what the throne stands for? And if that's true, then the lion stands for dominion authority. After all, he's the king of the jungle, and you have a throne there who's obviously the king of the universe. King of kings and Lord of lords. You have a calf, and I looked this word up too, because I thought, who wants on their banner a calf? Come on. It's not actually a calf. The literal translation for this word is young bullock. Talking about a strong young bull. It stands for strength and endurance and firmness. And what's really interesting to me is when you delve into the idolatrous world, you want to know what Egypt worshipped? They worshipped a lot of things. But one of the things that they worshipped was the young ox. It stood for deity. Maybe that's why when the northern and the southern tribes split, Jeroboam set up two golden, young bullocks. Do you know, trust me, I'm weird, I looked this up. Almost every religion of the world goes back and uses the head in some way, shape, or form in their religion. Man stands for intelligence. It's what different. And then, if you'll notice, the fourth creature, he adds a term to describe the animal. He doesn't just say it was like an eagle. He says it was like a what? Because a flying eagle adds intensity. I saw a YouTube video that was impressive. This kid sitting out there fishing, and he caught this fish, and you could see the eagle was hovering over top, and he started swooping down. And as he swooped down, this kid sitting here holding this great big fish, he waited until that thing was about 3 yards off the water, and then he chucked the fish in the air. And the eagle caught it in his talons and just swooped off with this massive fish. Watched another fish thing where he pulled a big bass right out of the water. How in the world he got that thing out of the water, I have no idea. And I watched a video of one swimming. It was in Alaska, and one of the boating captains there was like, check this out. This eagle is swimming, and it was flapping its wings, and it was going across the sea. And when it got to the island, it hopped out, and when it hopped out, it had this massive fish in its talons. So it couldn't pull it out of the water, so it just flapped its wings and swam, if you will, all the way across. What incredible power. What incredible speed. And so there are a lot of scholars that believe that these 4 things are talking about the dominion and authority of the King of Kings. They're talking about the strength and the endurance and the firmness, and they're talking about the intelligence, and they're talking about the power and the speed with which he deals. Now, we're going to close because we wouldn't be able to do justice to what they do, but I want to leave you with this thought. John is struggling to describe them. You have the second half of verse 6, you have verse 7, and you have part of verse 8. So in reality, you would have 2 full verses, half of 6, half of 8, and all of 7. Is all he gives us. I mean, Ezekiel writes a chapter. Man, these wheels are spinning, these things are taking off, and when they take off, these take off, and when they stop, the winds stop, and the voice of thunder, and there's lightning in the color of amber and beryl, and all this other stuff. John's like, there were these 4 creatures, and one of them looked like, and one of them was like, and one of them was like, and one of them was like. And that's all you get. That's it. Come on, John, this is another one. Why can't you be more like Paul? Give me a run-on that goes on for an entire chapter and tell me what this is supposed to stand for. He doesn't say for sure what they are. He has trouble describing them. He never says what they are. But next week, notice in verse 8, he doesn't have any problem at all telling us what they do. And he doesn't use simile and metaphors. At the end of verse 8, he says, and they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. And when those beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him that sat on the throne, and worship him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. Listen, this is what I can tell you for sure about these 4 beasts. I firmly believe with all my heart the cherubim, and I believe they're symbolic of a lot of things. But what John really wants us to know is they spend all of their time and effort doing what? And a little bit later, we're going to see that they are instrumental, because when the seals start to open, the first beast is going to run out and say, Come and see. And then the second seal is open, and the second beast is going to run out, and he's going to say, Come and see. So here's what I can tell you for sure from verses 8b down through verse 11. And it gets expanded in chapter 6 and 7. Because in chapter 6, it's all about they worship God. And when we get into chapter 7, you're going to start into the seal judgments, and you're going to find out that without question, they obey God. John says you can get all bent out of shape wondering what they are and what they represent and all this other. But what you really need to know is this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And these magnificent creatures, whatever they stand for and whatever they represent, or maybe they represent all of it, because all of it can fit. They worship the only one that is truly worthy of it. So should I. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, sometimes it is so easy for us to be drawn astray. Satan often makes things look so good and so deceitful. But really, the best way to tell a counterfeit is to know the truth. And so I trust as we continue to study in this book, you will ignite our hearts with a desire to know you. And the more we know about you, the more we recognize the lies of the world. Help us. Strengthen our faith. Give us a desire to search your word